The Nazis built what they thought was the perfect prison, a medieval fortress so secure, so impossible to break out of, that they sent only their worst nightmare prisoners there. But they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated what happens when you lock up the most creative, rebellious, and determined men in all of Europe in the same building. What happened next turned their escape-proof castle into the greatest embarrassment of the Third Reich. This is the story of Colditz Castle, a place that shouldn't exist in the history books the way it does. The Nazis wanted it to be a symbol of their control, their dominance. Instead, it became something else entirely. A place where prisoners didn't just survive, they thrived. Where men who should have been broken instead built theaters, orchestras, and even a flying machine in secret. This isn't just a story about escape. It's about what the human spirit does when you try to cage it. And it all started with one very bad decision by the German High Command. By 1940, the Nazis had a serious problem on their hands. Across occupied Europe, Allied prisoners of war were escaping. And we're not talking about one or two lucky breaks. We're talking about repeat offenders. Officers who escaped once, got caught, then escaped again. Pilots who crashed behind enemy lines and spent months sabotaging German operations before slipping through the cracks. Commandos who treated capture like a temporary inconvenience. These weren't ordinary soldiers. These were men who refused to accept defeat. Men who saw every prison camp as just another battlefield. And the Germans were losing that battle badly. Every escape was a propaganda disaster. Every recaptured prisoner cost resources. Every hole in the fence, every forged document, every tunnel dug under barbed wire was proof that the mighty Third Reich couldn't even keep prisoners locked up properly. So the Nazi leadership came up with what they thought was a brilliant solution. They would create one central prison, one fortress so secure, so impossible to escape from, that even the most determined prisoner would give up. They would gather all the troublemakers, all the escape artists, all the rebellious officers from every camp across Europe, and lock them away in one place, a place where escape was physically impossible. And they knew exactly where to put them. High on a rocky hill in Saxony, overlooking the town of Colditz, stood a castle that looked like it came straight out of a dark fairy tale. Built in the 11th century, Colditz Castle had walls that were 7 feet thick in places. It sat on a cliff that dropped straight down to the river below. There was only one road in and one road out. The castle courtyard was surrounded on all sides by buildings 5 stories tall. Windows were barred, doors were reinforced, and the entire structure was designed in a way that made it almost impossible to approach without being seen. The Germans looked at this medieval fortress and saw perfection. They called it O Flag 4C, a high-security camp for officers only, a place specifically designed to hold prisoners who had already proven they couldn't be held anywhere else. The Nazis were so confident in Colditz that they even boasted about it. They told the prisoners straight to their faces, "You are here because you cannot be trusted anywhere else. This castle is escape-proof. You will not leave until the war is over." But here's what the Germans didn't understand. When you take the most stubborn, creative and defiant men from Britain, France, Poland, the Netherlands, and beyond, and you lock them all in the same building, you're not creating a prison. You're creating a think tank, a laboratory of rebellion, a university of escape, and the curriculum was simple. Get out, no matter what it takes. The prisoners arrived at Colditz expecting hell. What they found was something stranger. Because the camp held officers only, the Geneva Convention applied more strictly here than in other camps. The Germans couldn't force them to work. They had to provide adequate food, shelter, and exercise. And because these prisoners were considered high risk, the guards were under strict orders not to provoke unnecessary incidents. The result was an odd sort of routine: roll call twice a day, meals that were barely edible but technically sufficient, a courtyard for exercise, and long, endless hours with nothing to do but think. For most prisoners, that kind of monotony would break them. But these men weren't most prisoners. They had been sent to Colditz precisely because they refused to be broken. So instead of sinking into despair, they did something unexpected. They built a world, a strange, secret, vibrant world hidden inside the castle's ancient walls. And it all started small: a deck of cards, a homemade chess set carved from pieces of wood, a man with a harmonica leading a sing-along in the courtyard. But it didn't stay small for long. Within months, the prisoners had formed an orchestra, not a bad one either. Men who had been musicians in their previous lives taught others how to play instruments they built from scrap materials. They held concerts in the evenings. Music echoed through stone corridors that hadn't heard anything but marching boots and shouted orders. The Germans didn't stop them. Music kept the prisoners calm. It gave them something to focus on besides escape. At least that's what the guards thought. But the music was never just music. The theater company the prisoners formed wasn't just about entertainment either. They built stages, sewed costumes from old blankets, painted backdrops on bedsheets. They performed full-length plays, complete with lighting made from stolen electrical wire and bulbs scrounged from storage rooms. German officers sometimes attended these performances. They sat in the audience and clapped politely, completely unaware that the stage they were watching had a hollow platform beneath it, where prisoners hid tools, maps, and forged identity papers. The chess sets carved from wood, the Germans saw them as harmless hobbies. What they didn't see was that the prisoners were using the carving tools to modify other objects, to file down metal, to shape pieces of furniture into tools, to create things that didn't belong in a prison. And that homemade radio, that was the crown jewel. Deep in a hidden space behind a false wall, prisoners had assembled a working radio receiver from smuggled components, stolen wire, and parts they built themselves. Every night, a small group of men huddled around that radio and listened to the BBC. They heard the truth about the war. They heard news the Germans tried to keep from them, and they passed that information to every prisoner in the castle through a network so efficient the guards never even suspected it existed. This was Colditz, a prison where men played music, performed Shakespeare, and listened to banned radio broadcasts. A place where prisoners didn't just survive, they lived. But all of this, every concert, every play, every chess game, was just a cover for the real work happening behind the scenes. Because beneath the culture and camaraderie, beneath the appearance of men resigned to their fate, something else was brewing, something the Nazis never saw coming. Colditz wasn't just a prison. It was an escape factory, and it ran like a business. The prisoners created an entire organization dedicated to one goal: getting men out. They called it the Escape Committee. Every nationality had representatives: British, French, Dutch, Polish. They met in secret, reviewed every escape plan submitted, and decided which ones had the best chance of success. They coordinated resources, assigned roles, and made sure that no two escape attempts interfered with each other. And the plans? They were brilliant. Tunnels were the obvious choice. Prisoners dug into the floors, into the walls, into the foundations of the castle itself. Some tunnels stretched for dozens of meters, burrowing under the courtyard toward the outer walls. The Germans found some of them, but for every tunnel they discovered, 2 more were already in progress, and the digging never stopped. Men worked in shifts, using spoons, knives, and tools they made from bed frames and stolen metal. They hid the dirt in their pockets, in fake walls, in the attic spaces above the dormitories. The Germans searched constantly, but the prisoners were always one step ahead. Disguises were another favorite method. Prisoners studied the guards, memorized their uniforms, their mannerisms, their routines. Then they recreated those uniforms from scratch. They dyed blankets to match the color of German jackets. They carved buttons from wood and painted them to look like metal. They sewed insignias by hand, stitching every detail until the fake uniforms looked real enough to pass inspection. Then, during roll call or shift changes, a prisoner would slip into a German uniform, walk calmly through the gates, and disappear into the countryside. Some got caught within hours. Others made it all the way to neutral Switzerland before being recaptured. Forged documents were critical. Every escaping prisoner needed identity papers, work permits, travel authorizations. The prisoners had men who were skilled artists, men who could copy German handwriting perfectly, men who understood bureaucracy well enough to forge stamps and seals that looked authentic. They stole blank forms from the German administrative offices. They bribed guards for information. They even managed to photograph real documents and recreate them by hand. The forgery operation inside Colditz was so sophisticated that some of the papers they produced were better quality than the ones the Germans were using. The Germans knew all of this was happening. They knew the prisoners were planning escapes. They increased security, added more guards, conducted random searches at all hours of the day and night. But it didn't matter. The prisoners adapted. They created lookout systems, coded signals, and warning networks that allowed them to shut down an operation in seconds if a guard got too close. They hid contraband in places the Germans would never think to look. Inside hollowed-out table legs, beneath floorboards that looked nailed down but lifted right up, behind fake panels in the walls that blended so perfectly you'd never notice them unless you knew exactly where to press. And through it all, the culture continued. The music, the plays, the chess games. The Germans saw prisoners who seemed content, men who joked, who laughed, who filled their days with hobbies and entertainment. What they didn't see was that every moment of normalcy was a carefully constructed illusion, a smokescreen designed to hide the most ambitious escape operation of the entire war. But even among all these plans, all these tunnels and disguise and forged papers, one plan stood out. One plan so audacious, so insane, so utterly impossible that even the escape committee hesitated to approve it. Because this wasn't a tunnel, this wasn't a disguise. This was something no prisoner of war had ever attempted before. In the attic of Colditz Castle, hidden behind a false wall built from scrap wood, two men were building an airplane. Not a model, not a toy, a real, full-sized two-man glider designed to fly. The idea came from British officers Bill Goldfinch and Jack Best. They had both been pilots before their capture. They understood aerodynamics, weight distribution, lift, and they realized something the Germans never considered. The castle sat on top of a hill. The roof of the castle was high, and just beyond the outer wall was a river valley that dropped away steeply. If they could build a glider light enough to launch from the roof, the wind currents and the slope of the hill would carry them over the walls, over the guards, and down into the valley below. From there, it was a straight run to neutral territory. It sounded insane, and it was. But Goldfinch and Best didn't care. They drew up plans, calculated measurements, figured out how much weight the glider could carry and how much speed they'd need to get airborne. Then they started scrounging materials. They stole bed slats for the frame. They took wooden floorboards from a storage room nobody used. They collected every scrap of metal wire they could find and twisted it into supports. For the skin of the glider, they used bed sheets. They stitched them together using thread pulled from prison uniforms. They treated the fabric with boiled millet from the prison kitchen to make it airtight and weatherproof. The work took over a year. Every day, while the rest of the camp distracted the guards with theater rehearsals and music practice, Goldfinch and Best climbed into the attic and worked on their glider. They cut wood with smuggled saws. They glued joints using paste made from potatoes. They tested every piece, every joint, every measurement to make sure it would hold together when the moment came. And slowly, impossibly, the glider took shape. Wings that stretched nearly 20 feet across, a fuselage just large enough for two men to squeeze into, a tail section with a rudder carved from wood and balanced with stolen weights. It looked fragile. It looked like it would fall apart the moment it hit the air. But according to their calculations, it would fly. The plan was simple. When the time was right, they would break through the roof of the attic, drag the glider onto the ridge, and launch it using a pulley system made from a bathtub filled with rocks. The weight of the bathtub dropping would pull the glider forward, giving it just enough speed to clear the castle walls and catch the wind. From there, gravity and aerodynamics would do the rest. It was dangerous. It was reckless. It had a dozen ways it could go horribly wrong, but it was also brilliant. And if it worked, it would be the greatest escape in the history of the war, but they never got the chance to find out. In April 1945, the war was ending. Everyone could feel it. The prisoners heard it on their hidden radio. The German guards knew it too. You could see it in their faces. The air raids were constant now. The sound of Allied artillery echoed in the distance. The German officers who had once strutted through the courtyard like they owned the world were now nervous, distracted. Some of them started disappearing. Reassigned, they said. But everyone knew what that meant. The Reich was collapsing, and Colditz was about to change hands. On April 15th, the guards abandoned the castle. They didn't make a big announcement, they just left. One morning, the prisoners woke up and realized there were no guards at the gates, no roll call, no patrols. The gates were still locked, but the castle was empty. For a few hours, nobody knew what to do. Then American forces arrived. The prisoners were officially liberated. The war, for them, was over. And in the attic, the glider sat waiting, fully built, ready to fly. But it would never launch. The war ended just weeks before Goldfinch and Best planned to make their attempt. Years later, historians and engineers examined the glider. They ran the numbers, checked the measurements, tested the design, and their conclusion? It probably would have worked. The glider was solid, the plan was sound. If the war had lasted just a little longer, 2 men might have actually flown to freedom from the roof of an escape-proof castle. Colditz wasn't just a prison. It was proof of something the Nazis never understood. You can lock people up. You can take away their freedom. You can put them behind walls so thick no tool can break through. But you can't imprison the human mind. You can't cage creativity. You can't kill hope. The men of Colditz refused to be broken. They built a culture, they built a community, and they built a glider that never flew, but still soared in the imagination of everyone who heard the story. The Nazis thought Colditz would be their triumph, a symbol of their control. Instead, it became their greatest embarrassment. A place where prisoners didn't just survive, they thrived. Where every day was an act of defiance. Where men who should have been crushed by despair instead created music, art, and engineering marvels. And where, in a dusty attic, a 2-man glider sat waiting to prove that even the most impossible dream can come true if you refuse to give up. Colditz wasn't escape-proof. Nothing ever is. Because the one thing you can never cage is the will to be free. If you want more untold stories like this, hit subscribe.